Thanks everyone for making some time to join us here on our launch meeting for our Success Network Policy Committee. I will introduce myself just momentarily, but wanted to just provide a warm welcome for all of you who are on the line here. Many familiar faces and names, some newer faces and names to me. I can't see all of you because I'm sharing my screen, but just so happy to have all of you here. And I'll just sort of dive right in. Today, we're going to be going through a few topics, right? So we're going to be talking about sort of getting ourselves reacquainted here in just a second. We're going to get an overview of the Illinois Education and Career Success Network. We're going to review some key report card data that has come out this year, and we're going to talk through some emerging policy changes that have just come about. And we are going to also dive into a discussion around sort of what we want to do together, what kinds of topics that we want to engage in together. And Kathy, for your question, we will absolutely share the deck out afterwards. We will also share a recording of the session today. And so we will be capturing all of this robust conversation moving forward. So there's going to be kind of a combination of providing a bunch of information at you all, and then also wanting to hear from you all both in the chat as well as sort of verbally over the course of the day. And so we just appreciate you all being a part of it here. So would love for folks to just add into the chat here, because there are almost 60 people on the line, which is an amazing thing to see in the kind of final full work week of December, which is always an adventurous time. If you could share your name, organization, and one thing you're looking forward to in 2023 in the chat. It's also always exciting to see the real range of folks who are on the line. We have folks kind of all across the P20 spectrum here, and workforce development as well. So we'll go ahead and dive into intros. Unfortunately, one of the people who's on this slide is stuck in computer purgatory right now, but she will join us as soon as humanly possible. But I'll just introduce myself. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Emily Ruska. I'm Director of State Policy and Strategy at Education Systems Center at Northern Illinois University, aka Ed Systems. We're one of the 3 network organizers for the Illinois Education and Career Success Network. Edith will talk more about what that means in a minute, but I'll kick to Edith to introduce herself as well on the line here.
Hi, everyone. I'm Edith Juguna, Director of the Illinois Education and Career Success Network, and very excited for the Success Network Policy Committee work.
Yes. And then Laura Monagudo will be joining us shortly, and you'll be hearing a lot more from her as we continue to dive into this work as a policy committee. She's a newer member of our team, although she's been with us for about half a year now and has already been adding so much value to our team. She is going to be really integral in this policy committee work and how we move forward with it. So what is it that we're trying to accomplish with this policy committee? So as many of you know, there previously have been structures through the Illinois P20 Council and elsewhere to gather practitioners and policymakers around issues around college and career readiness and success broadly. And we wanted to make sure that those kinds of spaces continue to exist and to be able to tap into the real deep expertise that each and every one of you brings to the table here. So we're trying to convene this table to both have local practitioners, both from within the Illinois Education and Career Success Network, as well as outside the network, and bringing in state policymakers. We've got some state agency folks on the line to really have collaborative discussions around the topics that are most relevant and impacting our students, right? And thinking about how do we work together to advance more equitable outcomes for young people in our state and make sure that our systems are working in alignment with one another. So generally, our plan is that we will meet quarterly and occasionally more often than that as certain topics pop up, but really talking about and learning about new and emerging policy areas in education and career success, talk about promising practices that are emerging from local practitioners, including many of you on the line here, engaging with data, identifying new priorities, and that can be from the data, that can be from those local practices, and really thinking about how do we translate these innovative local practices into innovative state policy and get frameworks in place that make your lives easier as practitioners on the ground and make state policymakers' lives easier by identifying the things that will be of greatest value to the field. So with that, I'm going to hand it to Edith to talk through a little bit more about the Illinois Education and Career Success Network. Edith, just let me know when you want me to advance slides.
Great, thanks, Emily. So we thought it would be helpful to give a little bit of background on the Success Network. I know that many of you are very familiar with it and have been engaged from the very beginning. So just bear with us as we provide some overview for newer folks. So the network was created in 2013, and 3 organizations came together: Advance Illinois Education Systems Center and the Illinois Student Assistance Commission, to create the network because the P20 Council had set a goal that 60% of Illinois adults have a high-quality college degree or credential by 2025. And we were hearing about a number of collaboratives across the state that were coming together to work on this goal, but there wasn't a statewide infrastructure to support these collaboratives. And so we thought, what if we created a network that could bring folks together from across the state to share best practices, learn from one another, and help inform state policy on strategies to advance post-secondary attainment. Next slide. And so the network's goal is to support communities to increase meaningful and equitable post-secondary attainment. And when we talk about meaningful, we're really talking about supporting students to pursue post-secondary goals that are of interest to them and that will lead to family-sustaining wages. And when we talk about equitable, we want to ensure that we're reaching students who are farthest from opportunity. Next slide. And so in 2015, we created what we call the Leadership Community Designation. These are communities that had systems in place to really work with different partners to advance post-secondary attainment. We started with 6 communities in 2015 and are now 18 communities strong. Next slide. And so what are expectations of leadership communities? We ask that they define a geographic focus area, and we're very flexible about what this is. In some communities, it's a community college footprint. In other communities, it's a county-wide or multiple counties. In others, it's a number of school districts that come together to focus on advancing post-secondary attainment. And then we ask that they document a partnership with folks from secondary, post-secondary, workforce, community-based organizations, municipal leaders, because we know that no one entity can be responsible for supporting students. And we use a collective impact approach that helps folks work together to solve difficult problems. And then we ask, yes, and thanks to all the leadership communities that are here today, we ask that they identify a trusted intermediary organization to support the different partners that are working together towards the community goals. I know many of you have been to meetings where great ideas are discussed, but if there's nobody to help really make sure that things get done and that folks do the things they commit to, then nothing happens. So we see that as the role of the intermediary. And in some cases, it's a nonprofit organization or the Chamber of Commerce. These also come in a variety of ways. And then we ask that they use data for continuous improvement and that they develop a plan based on their local needs to implement key strategies to advance post-secondary attainment. Next slide, please. And so the supports that the network offers include this peer-to-peer learning and action network where communities can learn from one another. And then we provide technical assistance on collective impact and other strategies to advance post-secondary attainment. One of the big ways we do this is through an annual conference. Plug for the conference here. It will be on March 8th at Moraine Valley Community College. We hope that you will all sign up for it, and we'll share that information later. And then we gather and curate critical education and workforce data to help communities inform decisions about areas where they're making progress and where more work is needed. And we serve as a conduit for financial support to communities. So we seek funding from private and public sources, which we then give to communities to implement some of the strategies that they identify. Next slide, please. So in terms of the scale of the network, we continue to grow. And right now, 45% of public high school students statewide are in schools that are in the network. And 34% of all high school students outside Chicago are represented in the network. Next slide. So what are we learning from leadership communities? I know many of you are familiar with the Post-Secondary and Workforce Readiness Act that was signed into law in 2016. that uses a student-centered approach to really support students as they transition from high school into post-secondary. There are 4 key strategies, and we are really seeing leadership communities serving as the tip of the spear for many of these policies. I'll just give one example, but there are many others. So for the college and career pathway endorsements, the graduating class of 2022 had nearly 600 students that graduated with an endorsement, and 500 of those students more than 500 of those students were from leadership communities. So we're very excited about what we're seeing happening in leadership communities, and see them as a way to inform state policy as they, implement some of these strategies as the initial groups, and through their growing pains, help inform state policy on changes that are needed. And Emily, I think I'll kick it to you now.
Yeah, thanks, Edith. And like Edith said, we learned so much from leadership communities. We know many of you are represented on the line, and so shout out to you all. And in future meetings, we'll definitely highlight some of the sort of notable ways that leadership communities are demonstrating leadership, for lack of a better word, in implementing some of these policies and the success that we're seeing sort of broadly in the field in that way. What we're going to do now is review a handful of highlights from Illinois Report Card, recently released Illinois Report Card data, as well as some additional enrollment data on transitional instruction that's not on the report card, but is exciting to see. And the intention here is just to kind of surface some of those key data points that we like to look at and are interested in. We're not going to spend a lot of time discussing today. We're going to have kind of some reflection questions at the end for folks to drop thoughts in the chat about surprises, around insights that kind of are surfacing for you, et cetera. And our plan is to have a deeper dive into some of these data and have a deeper discussion around the data sometime in January. So stay tuned for that as well. Kind of one key data point that we often like to look at, and of course my controls are all over my title here, is are you guys seeing anything weird on the screen? You guys see the full slide, I assume? Great. Okay. Yes. So we're looking at the early college credit enrollment rates, right? So these are the percentage of students who are enrolling in at least one early college credit course. Up top, you've got the kind of overall rates. In green, you've got the AP enrollment rates, and in purple, you've got the dual credit enrollment rates. And certainly there are other forms of early college credit. AP and dual credit are just the 2 primary avenues for that in our state. You see that over time, enrollment rates in dual credit have been pretty steadily growing, and AP has sort of stayed relatively flat since 2018, but with a little bit of growth over time. But really, when we look at the underlying counts, we see that the bulk of the growth in the source of a lot of that growth in early college credit enrollment in the state tends to be dual credit. And that's driven by a lot of folks who are on the line here who have been working really hard with their post-secondary partner. A lot of secondary districts who have been working really hard with their post-secondary partners to scale up dual credit as a really key mechanism for early college access and transition supports, bridging post-secondary access more broadly. Looking a little bit under the hood at student demography and changes year over year, it's interesting to see this visual. I was personally kind of surprised by the data from the change of last school year to this school year in enrollment by demography, but it really just sort of highlights that over time, there have been points where dual credit access has been a really key point in sort of ensuring equitable access to early college credit broadly. Proportions of Black and Latinx students in particular are more typically comparable in enrollments in dual credit to their white peers than in AP. And so we see that as a kind of key access point for that early college credit, that early college acceleration. And I would say that in my mind, the sort of drops for Black and Latinx students in sort of the year over year in dual credit from last school year to this school year, or this previous school year, maybe just attributable to the fact that it was such a large jump in the prior year, and it's maybe less about any significant sort of drops in access per se, but we'll sort of spend more time with some of these data in the future and definitely welcome folks' reflections. When we look at high school graduation rates, we've got kind of similar patterns across the board by demography, but certainly we still see fairly significant gaps in four-year high school graduation rates by student demography. And that's something that we in the Success Network are keeping an eye on, and know that lots of districts are working on figuring out how to close those gaps and really accelerate graduation, particularly for Black and Latinx students. Really thinking about how we implement strategies that are supporting students to succeed not only in high school, but also beyond. So when we look at that the community college, when students are enrolling, we've got, I think I have this out of order, a little bit out of order. The post-secondary enrollment rates, we are seeing sort of overall declines in post-secondary enrollment. This is consistent with other states around the country. And so what's interesting, I think, about this particular visual is the fact that typically in recession type eras, you see an increase in community college enrollment versus four-year enrollment. We're actually seeing declines in both four-year and community college enrollment. So it's certainly discouraging, Laz. I couldn't agree more with your comment in the chat, and something that we need to think about. And what does it look like to address these challenges? What are the sort of underlying barriers and stopping points for students transitioning? Where are they going if not to college? What are the kinds of questions we can ask about what's happening with young people that will help us understand how we can attract them back into education and career programs? Jessica, to your question in the chat around certification programs, data on those types of programs can be really limited in different ways because no one entity controls those data. And so there are a lot of certification programs that happen at the community college. There are certification programs that happen through private programs. There are certification programs that happen through workforce funding. And so thinking about sort of how we can wrap our arms around that is something we can certainly continue to talk about with this group. And definitely, I know I've seen Laz's comments in the chat or popping up in the chat. Certainly encourage folks to share reflections in the chat as we're going through here for sure. So once students are enrolling, another kind of key touch point that we are concerned with is what's happening with students once they are getting to the post-secondary level, and what are some of the challenges that they may face when they make that transition. And one of those key challenges is certainly in needing to enroll in developmental education or remedial, what have historically been called remedial courses, right? We know that enrollment in remediation tends to slow students' progression towards degree completion, and also it can end up leading to students stopping out. So what this graph is representing is the overall, and then broken down by kind of course type, math and communications, remediation rates generally in the state for students who are Illinois high school graduates who are enrolling in Illinois community colleges and are needing to take at least one remediation course. And these can be in sequences, it can be a single semester, et cetera. But the challenges, and thank you, John, for the clarification, communications are English courses. The challenges that face students who have to enroll in Deb Ed is that counts against their financial aid clock, and it's not for credit typically, unless it's a co-requisite type course. But so there's multiple efforts underway to address this. And I think just what's worth reflecting on is these really impressive drops in remediation in math. And that is due to a lot of different efforts. We're going to look at some transitional math data in a second here, but something worth celebrating, that remediation is declining in the state, which hopefully means that we'll see better post-secondary outcomes for students who are not being slowed down by the need for remediation. So again, there's a number of different strategies to address the challenges with remedial education. And one of those things is by scaling up transitional instruction, right? And so transitional math has been in place for several years now. It's required under the Post-Secondary and Workforce Readiness Act. And what it does is it draws that remedial coursework down into the high school level to address those skills needs at the senior year through a course that guarantees placement upon successful completion into the 4-credit post-secondary math courses at the post-secondary level. And so what we're seeing is sort of massive increases in enrollment in transitional math as it's being scaled up across the state. The plurality of courses being offered are in sort of the general math, quantitative literacy, statistics pathway, but there are lots of students also enrolling in STEM pathways math and technical math as well. When we look at the percentage of the transitional math enrollments, while we don't have publicly available remediation data in a disaggregated fashion, which we are constantly advocating for, we do have transitional math enrollment rates sort of in our transitional math data sets that are disaggregated by demography. And so these are the percentages of students of the overall transitional math enrollments each year that are in each of these demographic groups, right? So what this is saying is that in the last school year, the 21-22 school year, that 41% of transitional math enrollees were Hispanic or Latino, that 37% were white and 18% were Black. So I'm going to ask that you in the chat pick one of these questions. Well, not the last question, but pick one of these 3 questions, whether it's something that surprised you, something that was exciting to see, or one thing you want to learn more about. Type a response, but don't hit enter yet. I'm going to give us about 30 seconds to type 1 or 2 reflections into the chat. And then when I say go, we're going to have everyone hit enter at the same time so that we have kind of a waterfall effect in the chat. So take about 30 seconds to type up a reflection or 2 in the chat and just hang on, be ready to hit enter in just a moment. Okay, on the count of 3, I'll encourage you to hit enter, and then you can feel free to type more in and add more in, but I just like the rush of seeing a bunch at the same time. So 1, 2, 3, go. Reflections on remediation rates, reflections on enrollment. Definitely agree that it's a little surprising to see both an increase in early college credit enrollments and a decline in post-secondary enrollment overall, as well as a decline simultaneously in remediation enrollments too. One other question that I'll offer is sort of, are there other data points that you want to learn about when we do a deeper dive in data in January? Want to see some data disaggregated by gender. Some of these data are disaggregable by that, and some of them are not as easily, but that is a very good question. Student voices along with the data, I love that thought. And that's something that we at Ed Systems are spending a lot of time thinking about. How do you both engage with data and then follow that up with deep engagement with the people who are represented in the data to understand what you're actually seeing, right? We can surface gaps, but understanding where those gaps come from requires getting a little bit closer to the ground and understanding student experience and what's happening with within our schools. So we're going to transition to sharing out some highlights around college and career success policy in our state over the course of this year. I'm going to hand it to Laura, who I encourage to introduce herself now that she is successfully in the room here. And shout out to computers for getting in the way up until this point. But we're going to go through some of these updates here and welcome reflections in the chat. And then we're going to shift to discussion after this about what we want to do together. So just keep that in mind as we're reviewing some of these key updates.
I am a policy and program manager with Ed Systems, and I am going to just start in with you on some of the highlights of policy related to college and career success in 2022. With Edith's introduction and conversation about the Success Network, she highlighted the Post-Secondary and Workforce Readiness Act. One of the biggest things to come out of 2022 in relation to this work was a bill expanding on the PWR Act. In particular, this bill did a couple big things. One, it required that districts serving 6 through 12 must elect into or opt out of implementing the PACE framework by July of 2025. And then it also is doing similarly for districts serving 9 through 12 in that they have to elect into or opt out of the college and career pathway endorsements. You can see there's sort of provisions in regards to scaling and 1 endorsement by a certain point, and then 2, 3 if the district serves a certain amount of students. And sort of what this bill asks of agencies and the state to help implement all of this is a couple things. First, to expand the PACE framework. Currently, the PACE framework starts at grade 8 or 9, depending on how each district is adapting it. And the state is currently working on updates to expand that down to 6th grade. So that is one of the ways the state is going to work to help with the implementation of this particular provision. And then also work on publishing a database of employer partners, as well as just other resources to support implementation. The college and career pathway endorsement implementation process is obviously many faceted. So wide array of resources to support that implementation. I believe on the next slide we can show, I think, is the next slide the scaling? Yes, okay. So Edith referenced this sort of in regards to the leadership communities, but this is just a general overall trajectory of the pathway endorsements since they were starting their implementation. So you can see the growth from 2020 to 2022 is pretty significant, and really one of the goals of the House bill that I was just talking about is to expand this even further. So we can really see the scaling happening. Yes, so what is next?
We have a live update, over 20 districts, we think.
Yeah, cool. So even more districts already since this data was put together that are granting CCPE. So it's really just in a growth trajectory that's going to continue with this new bill.
And the thing I'll just highlight is one, the 350 student threshold that was included in 3296 is based on the median size of districts serving high school students in the state. So it's grounded in that. You know, what we're trying to illustrate here, and in the range of districts that are represented in these data, there's not just big districts represented in these data. There's districts of a variety of sizes and geographic sort of realities that are represented in these data and implementing. So there are some really exciting examples of implementation already, and we are certainly excited to see sort of the growth that is going to be spurred by the default that's established through this legislation. Certainly, I think part of what we'll talk about with this group moving, in the future will be sort of, as that implementation is underway, what are the key challenges that are emerging? How do we address them? One of the resources, to Laura's point, that exists for Pathways development are the Perkins Model Programs of Study guides that have been developed in collaboration with leaders around the state. They're supported by the Illinois Community College Board. Folks from our team developed these in deep collaboration with advisory committees by endorsement area. Those endorsement areas as defined in the Post-Secondary and Workforce Readiness Act. A couple of new ones came out this year: Culinary Arts and Hospitality, as well as Human and Public Service. Those can all be found on that guides website. And then the Education Program of Study was updated to reflect early childhood education legislation that was passed last year. And so this is just sort of highlighting kind of the early childhood pathway integration into that model program of study guide. You can find all of those. Thank you, John, for dropping that link in the chat. And Jennifer, I see the kind of barriers that you're naming, and we definitely, that's definitely something we should continue to keep on the table moving forward as we talk about pathways implementation and what resources would be helpful for folks. Back to Laura.
So another piece of policy change that's come up within the last year relates to the Dual Credit Quality Act, which has already been the basis in the state for grounding a lot of the expansion of dual credit and creating several provisions that kind of help with that expansion. But to build on that, an amendment was passed A couple key pieces of this amendment are that it extends the professional development plan provision. So acknowledging that one of the barriers to dual credit can be the availability of dual credit qualified teachers. This provision is basically extending the deadline for teachers who are teaching dual credit while participating in a specific professional development plan to get that credential to teach dual credit, and giving them a little bit more time to do so. And then it's also building in some allowances for mixed enrollment classes in dual credit. So if there are school districts where perhaps there are some scheduling barriers and they're having not necessarily enough students to say place into a dual credit class to have a full class, they can mix in students who are receiving dual credit and offer some differentiated instruction. So this is a really new piece. So there's definitely still some guidance coming in terms of best practices for offering these mixed enrollment classes. I know that some of the agencies have been working on this, so there will be resources. This is a fairly new area in terms of dual credit in the state, but the hope is that it will help alleviate some of those scheduling problems that can come up and cause a barrier to offering dual credit. Emily, do you have anything else, or can we move to the next?
I'll just say that the mixed enrollment pieces, and I know John said in the chat, we're curious sort of how folks are leveraging the professional development plans locally, and we're also curious about how people are starting to think about the mixed enrollment class. Travis, the 9 graduate hours, we'll need to get, I think that is the same as it was previously, but these are the two, sorry, to Travis's question in the chat about the 9 graduate hours piece of the master's degree kind of pathway to professional development plan. I think that is the same as in the original Dual Credit Quality Act. It just is extended. Essentially what was going to happen was the PDP provision was going to be sunsetted, and it got extended through this amendment. And then the CTE instructor is actually a new addition in the professional development plan piece. But also welcome. I know Amy from Stand is on the line, so definitely welcome you adding your thoughts on the chat there as well. And then will colleges give credit if mixed? No, so mixed enrollment is in the legislation. It basically says before the beginning of the class, students must be notified which section they're placed in based on their, if they meet the placement requirements for dual credit. If a student passes the class, if they are not receiving the differentiated instruction that is like rising to, and this all has to be done in collaboration between the secondary and post-secondary partners. But if a student is not receiving the dual credit kind of level of the instruction and whatever that looks like, whether that's sort of additional examinations or assignments, et cetera, unless there is, I think, work around articulated credit, they're not going to receive dual credit for the course because they would be in the high school credit section. But again, this is a new area, so there's not a ton of detail that's sort of ready to be kind of acted on, I think, just yet.
So even further with dual credit, we have the dual credit survey. So this was a survey that was done of over 1,000 different stakeholders, all different types of stakeholders, teachers, students, family, but really just looking to gather more information around the strong interest and importance of dual credit that was coming up around the state. So there are several different resources kind of screenshotted here with links that we can provide for if you want to look deeper into a lot of these survey results. Ultimately, one of the things that came out of these survey results was just the importance of making sure that we're centering equity in a lot of the conversations that we're having around ways to expand dual credit in the state. This was a statewide survey that was conducted, so it's representing people from all over Illinois geographically. And you can see just with these screenshots, even it's really breaking down into lots of digestible pieces of information, a lot of the different responses that were received. When it comes to transitional instruction, just some different things that have been going on over the past year or so. Transitional math scaling continues. You saw some of the data about transitional math and the implementation, so you can see how it's really growing in terms of students that are being offered and enrolling in transitional math. Because transitional math has been implemented for, I think, almost 5 years. We're going through some evaluation currently. So we have a team that's working on both some qualitative evaluation that they've conducted, as well as really diving deep into some of the data that is available as to how effective transitional math is and what student outcomes have been like since transitional math was implemented. And then we are also in the process of launching a pilot for virtual transitional math. One of the goals and hopes of virtual transitional math is that it can alleviate some challenges that come up with implementing transitional math. Some information about what a virtual transitional math course includes and looks like. The piloting process is just beginning, so I believe we have one district that's partially launching the pilot in the spring semester, and then the rest of the pilot sites are primarily going to start in the fall. Transitional English, which is much newer than transitional math, implementation is just beginning. We have districts that are teaching and really diving into transitional English. Transitional English, there are more and more resources available as we work with our statewide advisory panel. We also had a very well-attended Transitional English Summit last week, and there was a lot of interest in continuing some of that professional development. So Transitional English is on the growing side of the scale, so that's definitely something that we're excited about.
And shout out to anyone on the line who's currently implementing either or both. I'm just going to highlight a couple of things that happened in sort of workforce development policy this year. There was a really big focus on equity in workforce development. Two kind of primary bodies were taking that on. One, the Governor's Commission on Workforce Equity and Access, the CWEA. I don't know if we're making an acronym of it. But the real focus for that group, which kind of convened over the course of the earlier part of the year, were on design enhancements and improvements for the workforce system, thinking about opportunities to kind of streamline functionality across our state agencies and workforce, just recognizing that there's a lot of players in the pool. And then thinking about what governance and leadership might be needed to really drive towards more equitable outcomes. There was a lot of deep engagement with sort of stakeholders and figuring out how do we make this a person-focused system. And so they have a final report that's forthcoming. The website is going to be linked in the deck when we share it out. The Illinois Workforce Innovation Board also convened an equity task force that had a few different work groups on policy and programs and data, and they made their final presentation to the IWIB in the middle of June. You can find the full report in their board materials. But some of those key themes that emerged from that work is that there's a real need to establish a culture of equity and applying an equity lens to the work of the IWIB. That there's a lot of investments needed in data resources and analysis, and that needs to be looking at disaggregated data that in such ways that can help inform policy and practice. That leadership should be more representative of the diversity of our state, and that there needs to be some professional development for folks who are working in workforce development broadly. And then that there needs to be kind of prioritization of organizations that are doing a good job of working with target populations and folks who have historically been kind of furthest from this opportunity, and really ensuring that there are supportive services in place for folks to really fully be able to take advantage of our workforce system. And then the final kind of workforce related piece that I'll note is the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. It was signed into law last year. One of the key things that it does is creates clean energy workforce training programs and hubs, 13 hubs across the state. So there's a lot of work that's being done literally right now around gathering input from the field and key stakeholders to understand what should a curriculum framework look like for clean energy jobs? How does that align to Pathways work broadly? How can these programs work together to really open up opportunity for individuals across the state, particularly those who have been directly impacted by environmental justice issues and those who have been kind of historically underrepresented in our workforce training system broadly. And so all of that development work is kind of underway. There will be notices of funding put out in 2023 for organizations and training providers to apply to deliver these types of programs. So yeah, Travis, your question about energy as a 17th career cluster in Illinois. I don't know, John, if you want to jump in and reflect on that at all.
For Travis. Yeah, I think when you look at the model programs and study guide, there is energy related occupations within the manufacturing and the engineering guide, as well as the architecture, construction, and energy area. So I think that part of the way that we're looking at Pathways work is that many of the training programs for example, for auto tech can actually be used to support for the electric vehicle market. The same for manufacturing, same for construction, and some of the clean energy work there as well. So I think the state's going to move away from a new 17th area to kind of looking to embed it within these other areas.
So stay tuned on all of that. But yes, I mean, like, you know, it's and what John was just describing around kind of the occupations that are emerging in clean energy, you know, not all of those are sort of named officially in our publicly available data sets around occupations and labor market information. And so that's, you know, being really clear about what those roles are and what those competencies are. We're really trying to emphasize learning from folks in the field about what those roles and competencies are so that these programs can really be geared towards that. Are there any kind of key policy highlights that anyone on the line thinks that we missed here, which we probably did, you know, so there's a lot that's been happening over the course of this year, but anything that we missed in the sort of education and career pipeline that anyone wants to hold up for the group here before we transition into more of a discussion?
So the next portion of this, I think, is we're primarily just going to focus on some conversation about moving forward with all of the information that we've received. We've offered to you. We have some questions that we're going to kind of take a peek at to see what thoughts any of you have. So the first set of questions is centered around the idea of elevating local practice. So I know both Emily and Edith highlighted earlier how that's an important part of the Success Network and an important part of the policy committee. So some questions, we're just going to discuss this as a larger group. So some questions that we have for all of you. What are any promising local practices that you would like to see the group learn more about, either in your community or that you just know about, that you want to learn more about? What kinds of practices have you seen that are driving equitable college and career outcomes? What are some core challenges that local leaders may be grappling with? So I think to start out, maybe focusing on the first two questions, but I know that oftentimes these topics kind of meld together. So if we address the third question or multiple questions at once, that's obviously totally fine too.
And I think feel free to speak up or raise your hand in the Zoom function or put it in the chat, whatever format works well for you.
I'll go
yes,
first.
so go ahead, Brian, and then we'll go to Travis after you.
Oh, sorry. I just didn't want John to be shocked if I went through a meeting without saying something. So one of the things I'm celebrating in my region is our community college has a new president, and he has put a dual credit initiative in place called 12 by 12 by 12. He would like high school students in our region to graduate with at least 12 hours in dual credit by 12th grade. And the third 12 is $12 per credit hour, if you're wondering why it's a 312 initiative. Certainly one of the obstacles, skipping to question 3, which I don't know that, but I continue to hear, and John heard when he was out and so forth. He and Juan Jose came out to my region this fall. It was very helpful and productive meeting around pathways. And I actually have some schools that have submitted applications and others that are in process. But the impending foreign language requirement is going to, a lot of our dual credit is career and tech ed oriented, and it's going to, certainly stand in the way of students getting an opportunity to take career and tech ed courses if we don't have some reversal of that or exception made for people in pathways or something. So celebration and an obstacle. So
Thank you. Travis.
I'll follow the same suit and talk about a celebration. Just Waubonsie has been a great partner. Bob Cofield, who's on this call, has done a great job. One of the things I think that they've done, which I appreciate, is just how their students are able to show that they are ready for college credit bearing courses. It's not just one measure. And so that's something that is truly appreciated. Just speaking personally as a father, that's how my son was able to take an English dual credit class at Waubonsie. And he excelled in it, right? So it's not, when you look at, I think it'd be important as we look at how did individuals gain access, and then what success did they have? So measuring that metric, I think, would be an important thing to do. And I think just the core challenges, one of the things just for career experiences is we're more of a rural setting, even though we're 15 minutes from Aurora. And so we don't have a lot of industry. So anything that, we're so virtual. We have the ability to do so many different things. Any partnerships that we could create, again, either kind of globally that kids could engage in work virtually instead of being right there. You look at the work industry that is shifting. I know there's certain things that you have to have hands-on, right? But and we could set up field trip type things for that, like special, like every so often. But any type of work experience, things that we could do and think outside of the box, I think that would be a great thing that would impact a lot of districts in the state of Illinois.
Thanks, Travis. And definitely a lot of dialogue in the chat around sort of graduation requirements and balancing all that for sure, as well as staffing generally. That can definitely be, those are definitely some of the challenges we've heard before, but exciting to hear some of these highlights too. So shout out to the partners on the line making this happen. Other sort of practices or challenges that are emerging for folks, or that are kind of continuing for folks.
Just want to note Jill's note in the chat. Thank you for calling that out, kind of the currency conversation. And there is some work, we're going to look to publicize soon, some community colleges in particular that are leaning in on some of the currency opportunities, and hoping to continue to work with university partners in that space as well.
I'm going to put Bob on the spot because there's a couple of questions in the chat about the multiple measures placement work that is being done and that were highlighted by Travis in that conversation. But Bob, is there anything else you can sort of share about y'all's approach to multiple measures and how that's been working in your community?
Yeah, well, we had been working in that direction prior to the pandemic. As a college, we were adopting the high school GPA as an additional measure. And at the same time that was being implemented, the pandemic hit, and we were, like everybody else, we were faced with how to handle dual credit students that were going into English and math courses that no longer had access to a standardized test score. And so we made the decision internally to expand that high school GPA measure to also include dual credit students. And it has worked phenomenally. I mean, originally, I mean, it was a fair amount of work, obviously, because a lot of prerequisites internally had to be changed. I mean, the whole mechanism, required a big shift at the college. We had to put in a couple of different processes in place. But now that they are in place and have been for a couple of years, we have, gosh, I don't know. I don't even want to guess a number, but we have overwhelming response from our school district partners on that. And it has been really effective for students that are coming directly to our campus or one of our campuses to take classes, not for students that are, I mean, it has, well, let me backtrack. It has also really been helpful in a couple of settings where we're teaching courses at the high school, where students are being enrolled using their GPA. It's just been an extra, it's been an extra point of access, and it has. I would encourage anybody that any community college, and I know that we're not the only one. There are several others who are doing this before we were. College of Lake County, I can think of, Kishwaukee possibly. I don't know exactly which others, but there are several others who were doing this work before we did. It has really benefited the students and schools in our area to increase access, which is the reason that we did that to begin with. But I'll be happy to answer any additional questions on that.
Thanks for sharing that.
Mhm.
Jennifer, I see you oh, sorry,
Go
go ahead, jump, and then we'll go to Jennifer.
I was just to say, if I can toot our own horn again, just real quick, we expanded, I think we're 3 years ago, where we've been paying for, and I'm sure most districts are along this line, you've been paying for CTE courses where students attend career centers, probably for a really long time. And we've done a lot of work with career readiness and personalized learning and different things. And we just said, you know what, if we're paying for that, why aren't we paying for dual credit classes? So any of our students that are in the high school, we pay for up to 2 dual credit courses per semester. So we are fully funding that for our students. And again, that's an equitable type of a thing too, where we didn't want finances to be a barrier for our students to explore that option.
That's awesome. Jennifer, you had some thoughts to share.
Yeah, I was deciding if I should share this at this moment in time or not, because our data is not ready to share publicly. So there's the teaser as the next 6 months, this is going to evolve. But what Bob said with multiple measures and GPA, what we're finding locally is our students that we're losing are the students that have a GPA of, let's say, a B. Not our A students, not our lower end students, but our B students. So with that multiple measures approach, just think of the community college and the school districts in that region being able to, whether it's with the ISAC core or whatever resources we have in the region, really being to wrap around those students. If we know who the students that are not continuing to go, and there are B students. I mean, that was like, I got the data back and I was like, are you kidding me? This is real. This is what's happening locally. Now we can create a plan. And I just wanted to thank Brian for that sharing of the multiple measures approach, and then how I could back that into my high school if we were partnering and really provide a system of support for our students.
Emily, and I want to say this too, just as one last, because I think you asked it in your original question. We've not noticed any significant increase in, or I should say, a lack of success in those students where we have created that avenue. So, anybody that might be hesitant to maybe try to push for that in their own area, we've not had any noticeable negative impact on student success. If anything, it's allowed more students to access the opportunity, and they've been successful when they've been given that opportunity. So I think in that respect, it has worked out really well for those of us that were bargaining, for this for quite a while.
That's awesome to hear. And certainly we lean on partners like you to kind of elevate that narrative, right? Because it's easy to hear folks in the field sort of broadly saying, we don't want to water down quality or student success and, that kind of thing. But it's helpful to know that like when you're actually looking at the data, multiple measures placement works. And it doesn't have a bearing on student outcomes. It just is opening up the door for different students who might not have standardized test scores or access to various ways of demonstrating that readiness. Also appreciate seeing a lot of conversation in the chat around transportation challenges. That's something we can continue to talk about. And certainly there's a parallel with the Illinois Work-Based Learning Innovation Network, IWIN, to have lots of conversations around transportation vis-a-vis work-based learning in particular, but lots of conversation about that in the chat. And shout out, yes, to Heather from our team who does a lot of work on that front. I also, Jill, would welcome sort of any insights that you've generated based on kind of getting those deep data systems together to track the college and career readiness indicator. That's something that a lot of folks on the line here have been a part of the conversation around before. And we know that that's a lot of new data collection for folks. So just if there are any kind of key lessons learned there that you want to highlight for the group, would invite that.
So definitely not perfect. And we're okay with that. We're getting better each year, but we did purchase a tool to help us, for one, that follows our students 6th grade through 12th grade, that houses a lot of our information. But then the bigger piece in moving such a large organization of adults, even, that's been kind of the challenge, is who's owning different components of that CCR data and what is going to be the system, and making sure students are logging those experiences and moving towards their goals. So I meet with our high school administrators, each one of the assistant principals and principals, every month. And a good portion of our agenda for the last 2 years has been around this and kind of developing the systems of identifying kids early and then having those conversations with them along the way. Our next one is, how are we going to identify by April each of those cohorts of students who are going to graduate with the diploma endorsements, and making sure that they finish those tracks. But there's a lot involved, quick overlap, but I think getting your building leadership engaged at a high level and owning different components of that has been the biggest traction that we've been able to get.
I just wanted to mention, because apprenticeships are such a big thing in the Quad Cities area. We have apprenticeships not only in CNC and welding, but also non-traditional careers such as IT, bank telling, all those sorts of things. So a lot of them are, you go through it for your junior year, you take a couple of classes at least, then the summer between your junior and senior year, you go on site at the employer's place of business and you start working full time. And then in the senior year, you continue with your classes and you still work part-time. And then you finish your apprenticeship afterwards. This has worked very well, and it's been embraced. As you know, we're on the river, so it's been embraced by both sides, and it's all accredited by DOL. So that's something that is working for us, and we're trying to get it into the counties that are a little further out. But they are, the way Iowa's DOL has done it, because Deere got involved, our big business here. But they actually were able to do this, the state of Iowa and then Rock Island County. And we're trying to increase that just because it has been such a big thing for students and for the CTE education. So.
Okay, so this seems like perhaps a good time to shift to sort of our second set of discussion questions. So another goal that we have for this committee is to draw people together so we can get some of the opinions and conversations to influence emerging policy. So the next set of questions basically is hopefully the time that we can highlight some emerging issues that we should explore for policy solutions, or any innovative state or local policy we should learn more about, policy barriers that maybe we need to explore and address together. So if anyone has any thoughts on any of those questions, we can kind of shift the conversation at this point.
I think we've already heard it, but I mean, the reality of the state system as we continue to have more graduation requirements mandated on us, and we're attempting to implement the model programs of study, that career exploration and also opportunity for dual credit might not exist as those pathways are presented. So it's a tension that's going to continue to be emphasized, especially as we get to the point where every high school district is expected to have at least one pathway in place. So how can we be proactive to educate our state agencies as well as our General Assembly and legislators that this could potentially be a problem?
Thank you, Jennifer. I was gonna say, I saw a lot of comments in the chat about transportation as well. Would love to know if there's any emerging or creative thoughts from a policy standpoint about how to begin to get at some of the transportation barriers for expanding work-based learning.
Dr. Karat, are you at a moment where you can share more? I know we get a reimbursement for vocational. Is it lack of drivers, lack of the trip being reimbursable? I'm trying to understand. Maybe she's not available to speak. Sorry, Dr. Karat, if you're not available.
Yeah, I am. Hold on. Yeah, thank you. So some of the things, hi everyone, some of the things that we're experiencing is just utilizing solely school buses, only school buses, being able to transport students to and from school. And I have my transportation director. Josh, can you add some information to that, please? I just called him because it's a cold call.
Sure, no problem. So as far as limitations on use of vehicles, obviously to and from school, we're restricted to use the yellow bus. There's other circumstances like between attendance. So for us, we have a vocational school. Those transportation buses. There's some athletic events where we're restricted yellow buses. So that always, that puts additional burden on the transportation department. So not only are we, attempting to get kids to and from school, but we're also required to do additional transports over and above that. That puts a lot of stress on our resources. Where in some instances where MFSABs or the white buses might be able to be used in some of these. So that's some of the limitations that we experience because of the restriction to a yellow bus.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Okay. Thanks, Josh. Bye-bye.
And just to add to that, there was a number of years ago, I can't remember how long ago it was, where they changed where you couldn't have passenger vehicles. It was over 10, I think, right? So they were seeing a lot of districts had bigger vans, and they were transporting students for different types of trips like that. And they've been banned that you have to use certain vehicles. And right. So I would think that the safety of transportation, even just revisiting that, the why behind some of those decisions of restricting the different vehicle use, and what we can do moving forward. If there's something that you can prove that this vehicle meets a certain standard, that you could use it for different ways. Teacher shortage is real. Bus driver, transportation, like if we can't get kids to school, how are we going to educate them? That is, I think, a huge area, not just for work-based learning, but for just school in general.
Yeah, and I was, just to add to that, I was just reading someone's update, and we were talking about implementing an automotive dual credit program through Illinois Central College. And we currently have 6. And the report I received was we would have all 10, but transportation could not be provided. So I was reading that this morning, and that's why I thought we need to talk about transportation and see if there's anything that we can do to policy and make some changes to expand.
So the innovative policy solution, John, is that the white, what we call the activity buses, could be used for reimbursable vocational transportation. I mean, this is huge, but I'm in a rural district. I mean, this is sitting on my desk today because I have to pass my CDL to drive a yellow bus. I mean, so there's a lot of the rural superintendent trying to pass my CDL is just, anyway, a side conversation.
Oh.
So we'll definitely
learning.
plan to dive deeper into transportation
Yeah.
issues in the future, because this is obviously such a real concern. I want to make sure that we are able to surface any other sort of core topics that are bubbling up for folks that we should definitely spend some time with in the future, and appreciate Dr. Karat, you calling in reinforcements on the transportation to clarify some of those specific challenges. But Mike, I don't know if you want, I know that you put in the chat stuff around college access and affordability. If there's anything in particular you want to kind of elevate for the group that's emerging there.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of affordability, I think there's no substitute for equitable and substantial reinvestment, in our colleges and universities. I think a lot of the unfortunate trends we've seen in Illinois are, can be attributed at least in part to affordability. So that's definitely an area I think we can work together on. And certainly, the partnership is looking at public university funding, and we'll be looking at community college funding and analyzing those systems and thinking about how, we can make sure it's adequate and equitable. But I would really be interested to hear, from others too around access. I think that there's a lot of innovative potential opportunities in how we can expand access, both to college and then, within transfer. And so, yeah, I think that I would really like to hear, as this group kind of develops these other potential opportunities to align on what others think about that.
Awesome, thank you. Amy from Stan, I'm going to put you on the spot. Anything else that's kind of bubbling up in your neck of the woods that, or Anne from Advanced, certainly curious if there are other sort of topics that we haven't talked about yet that we should make sure to explore at some point in the future with this group. Oops.
Two things that were just top of my head. I don't know if they should sit lower on the priority list, but worth exploring as we think about the high school graduation requirements. I also am interested in how that relates to also the school accountability requirements and how we can continue to incentivize more districts and schools to invest and create innovative pathways through all of our systems. So we're all rowing in the same direction and kind of what's working and what's not working there. So I would just kind of keep those on the table so we're not accidentally creating the wrong incentive structure. And then the second one is with the map changes. I'm curious as kind of map expansion happens and eligibility changes, if there are other areas that are worth talking about there as we talk about affordability. And I know we have to be really careful when with expanding map too much, because then it doesn't go far enough and it doesn't help all of our students. But I just want to make sure we've thought through, are we driving map where we need to drive it?
I've got nothing to add here. I think this has been such a great discussion. I think a lot of the points that I was kind of hoping in rabbit holes to go down, you guys have already kind of opened those hatches. So I think this is great. Thank you.
I'm also seeing some conversation in the chat around staffing and around, innovative strategies, particularly around staffing for career and technical education and work-based learning. So that's definitely, we'll capture everything from the chat as well, and try and synthesize some of these themes for sure. Well, feel free to keep adding stuff in the chat, but we'll move forward. So our next meeting will be sometime in Q1. We're also going to plan for a sort of data specific meeting where we can kind of spend more time with data, and diving in and having conversations about it and what it means and what we need to learn more about. Don't forget to opt in. We'll drop that link in the chat. We'll also email, we've cast a broad net to invite folks today, and we don't want to spam people who don't want to join. So we're going to be refining that email list and sort of confirming folks' interest in continuing to participate. So if you haven't already opted in, please do complete that form that Laura just dropped into the chat. And we will kind of use that as the basis for who we're going to communicate with moving forward, and just sort of cross-checking our various lists. Folks can opt in at any time. This is not only by invitation. I mean, we had some targeted invitations to make sure that we had those of you who are online on the line, but it's an open invitation. So feel free to pass that link along to folks that you think might be interested in joining these conversations. And we'll keep that moving from there. As a reminder, we've got the Illinois Education and Career Success Network conference coming up in March on International Women's Day, coincidentally. But March 8th in person at Moraine Valley Community College. It's going to be a great time. We're going to do a cocktail reception the night before to celebrate our decade of being a network. So please be sure to join us at the conference. It's always a great time. There's so much robust information that comes out of those conferences. We have a tremendous keynote speaker in Dr. Amy Lloyd coming from the U.S. Department of Education. She's going to be sharing a lot about pathways and work at the federal level and highlighting how that connects to work that we do here in Illinois. But really, we hope to see you all there. And apparently I am now taking us to the website. I'm sorry. But otherwise, thank you so much to all of you who have taken an hour and a half out of what is a always busy time of year, crunching 1 quarter's worth of work into what feels like 4 functional work weeks. So just appreciate you all being here and all of your contributions over the course of the conversation today. We're so excited to continue on this journey with all of you and to learn from you and to highlight your work, to have some of you present on future meetings about the work you're doing, and just sort of build this plane together. So thank you all so much. Thank you to Laura, who did so much work to make this meeting happen. Thank you to Edith for your leadership of the Success Network. And thank you just to everyone for joining, and hope you all have a safe and wonderful end of the year.